They're coming!
Oh?
The goddamn robots!
I don't understand.
Let me explain.
There will be fewer and fewer jobs that a robot cannot do better. What to do about mass unemployment? Ultimately, we will have to have some kind of universal basic income.
This is not a new idea. It's been tossed around for decades. Martin Luther King mentioned it in a speech back in 1967.
Guaranteed minimum income.
And Milton Friedman, who's not your typical communist hippie, described the idea in a book published in 1962.
I propose something called a negative income tax, essentially a minimum income.
The idea recently regained hype with the support of presidential candidates Andrew Yang and also of the tech billionaires who work very hard to help destroy as many jobs as possible as soon as possible. But what exactly is the universal basic income? There are many variations, but basically, it's a minimum wage guaranteed for all citizens, usually around $1,000 a month. Obviously, money for nothing does have a cost. The math is simple. The US have 250 million adults, so giving them $12,000 a year costs $3 trillion a year. The money has to come from somewhere. What's been proposed by Andrew Yang is a VAT tax of 10%, basically making all goods and services 10% more expensive. The assumption behind that is that very rich people spend so much more than the rest that this extra 10%, when applied to their Bentleys and 24-karat Rolexes, could finance the monthly $1,000 of the rest of the citizens. And it might work, who knows? But okay, leaving the money question aside, there's a more philosophical question behind the concept of getting money without working.
How do people then have meaning? If you're not needed, if there's not a need for your labor, what's the meaning? Do you have meaning? Do you feel useless?
Useless. The assumption here is that work gives a meaning to our lives. Has it always been like that? Let's go back to the beginning. Not that beginning, a bit later. Earth was inhabited by small groups of nomadic people who lived by fishing, hunting and gathering wild food. And they didn't seem to have a concept of work, in the sense of, something painfully boring that you must do every day to pay your rent and eat. In all groups that have been studied by anthropologists, there wasn't even a word to describe this concept. Of course, hunter-gatherers have things to do, get the food, make their clothes, build their homes, but these activities are not seen as unpleasant because they make sense and because they require a high level of skills. Plus, they're performed when it's time to, or when people feel like it, and they usually don't take too long to complete. Research studies suggest that hunter-gatherers work somewhere between 20 and 40 hours a week, which leaves a lot of time for leisure activities like games, religious ceremonies, making music, singing, dancing, or just chilling, and that's the life humans have lived for thousands of years.
Then what? What then?
Around 10,000 BC, in several places, people started growing food instead of just running behind it.
Brilliant.
Now they could stockpile lots of food and feed a large population. Cities were built, money and writing were invented, and so were wages and work contracts. This 5,000 years old clay tablet, for example, found in the city of Uruk in modern-day Iraq, is thought to be one of the oldest payslip ever discovered. The sedentary way of life also enables to own way more things than the nomadic lifestyle. Because you don't have to pack your things on a horse every time you move around. Now you can own land, houses, luxury items, and even human lives. As a consequence, wealth inequality rose. Agrarian societies were governed by a small, wealthy elite that didn't have to work, and they despised work. Check out what the Greek hipster Aristotle wrote around 300 BC. The citizens must not live a mechanic life, by that he means working manual labor, or a mercantile life, for such a life is ignoble and inimical to virtue. Nor yet must they be tillers of the soil, for leisure is needed both for the development of virtue and for active participation in politics. And most thinkers of the classical age, Greeks or Romans, agreed with the beard. Non-intellectual work, whether physical or mental, was believed to corrupt the body and the soul, and it took too much time, thus impeding the worker to take part in the social and political life of the city. Moreover, in ancient Greece and Rome, the supreme ideal of human life was independence. The primary goal of wealth wasn't to buy expensive stupid shit and show off, but to free man from the obligation to work. This freedom enabled to exercise the mind and the body and achieve wisdom and virtue.
I see.
So going back to the initial question, no, they weren't waiting for work to give a meaning to their life. 2,000 years later, not much had changed.
Same shit, different day.
In the 16th century, the aristocracy all over Europe still despised work. As Sir Thomas Smith, a British diplomat, defined it, a gentleman is one who could live idly and without manual labor. So when did it change? How did we go from this to that?
Thank God it's Monday.
TGIM.
We have to go back to the 16th century in Europe, when a growing movement started to challenge the legitimacy of the Roman Catholic Church. The Protestant Reformation has made a profound impact on all aspects of life in countries of Northern and Central Europe. Max Weber, a German sociologist and economist with a stylish fringe haircut, argued that Protestants had developed a distinct work ethic as a path to salvation. For the first time in history, they set a cultural norm that doing a good job for its own sake had a positive moral value as a service to God. Weber coined the term Protestant work ethic. These ideas slowly infused into the Western culture and blossomed during the Industrial Revolution. The 19th century philosopher Thomas Carlyle, who had a more traditional approach to the fringe, named this phenomenon a gospel of work, an almost religious reverence for work. As he wrote, "All work, even cotton spinning, is noble. Work alone is noble." Suddenly, industrial England seemed obsessed with work. As the historian Walter Houghton put it, after God, the most popular word in Victorian England was work. This glorification of work quickly spread throughout industrializing Europe, and of course, the wealthy elite encouraged it with great enthusiasm.
Why? Why?
Bernard de Mondeville tells you why. In a free nation where slaves are not allowed of, the surest wealth consists in a multitude of laborious poor. Bernard might be a cynical bastard, but he ain't no retard. Having an army of desperate guys begging for your shitty paid job is surely a great way to maximize profits in your factory. In the glory days of early capitalism, the owners of mines and factories had a clear goal: squeeze their workers as hard as possible. And you might think that shamelessly exploiting people would lead to but the beauty is, most of the time it doesn't. As long as people work, they're too busy running the rat race. Nietzsche wasn't a fringe guy, but his mustache defied the laws of physics. Anyway, as he explained, in the glorification of work, I see that work is the best policeman, that it keeps everyone in bounds. Thus, a society in which there is continual hard work will have more security. And security is now worshipped as the supreme divinity. By the way, the excessive glorification of work is not a Western privilege. In Japan, death by overwork is so common that they even have a word for it, karoshi. That describes the hundreds of employees every year that suffer stroke or commit suicide as a direct result of working very long hours. The Koreans call it guarosa, and the Chinese, golaosi. Many political scientists and economists believe that Confucianism played a large role in shaping this Eastern Asian work ethic, as it happened with Protestantism in the West. Anyway, in the early 19th century, in all industrialized countries, the working day ranged from 10 to 16 hours, 6 days a week, and child labor was just a normal thing. It took some decades-long battles to secure some ridiculous rights, like the 10-hour day for women and children in England, or the 12-hour day after the February Revolution in France. In the late 19th century, the fight for the 8-hour day intensified. In Europe, the 8-hour day was implemented first in the newly founded Soviet Russia in 1917, just 4 days after the October Revolution. In most of the European countries, it was voted in the wake of World War I, probably in part motivated by the threats of local communist parties. In the US, it was only adopted in 1940, and in the UK, well, bad example.
Then what?
Then humans built more and more machines and cars and computers, and productivity went like this. In fact, technology improved productivity so much that according to Eric Rauch from MIT, an average worker in the US would now only need to work 11 hours per week to produce as much as one working 40 hours in 1950. Yet most industrialized countries are still stuck on the 40 hours week. For half a century we have chosen to produce more instead of working less.
Why?
Partly because we chose to possess more. The more things we produce, the cheaper they are. Mass production makes mass consumption possible.
Oh, yeah!
But why do we consume? The man with a fancy double fringe, Thorstein Veblen, explained it perfectly in 1899. To attain, retain, and gain greater social status within their social class, low-status people emulate the respected high-status members of their socio-economic class by consuming overpriced brands of goods and services. In other words,
advertising has us chasing cars and clothes, working jobs we hate so we can buy shit we don't need.
So here we are, stuck in the rat race. Work, consume, show off, repeat. In the value scale of modern societies, money is overrated and time is underrated. Nietzsche had it figured out in 1850, by the way. Today, as always, men fall into two groups, slaves and free men. Whoever does not have 2/3 of his day for himself is a slave, whatever he may be, a statesman, a businessman, an official, or a scholar. The huge shockwave of automation will force us to rethink the place of productive work in our societies. We need to reassess the value of non-consuming leisure activities, how we take care of older people, how we educate younger ones, how many books we read, etc. Otherwise, as Hannah Arendt wrote it in 1958, we will have a society of workers without work. That is to say, deprived of the one activity that remains for them. One can imagine nothing worse.